Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. Today on the show, we have Bennet Zelner. Bennet's a really interesting fellow, and I think we get into some new territory around economics and psychedelics that I know we haven't really talked about too much here on the show. So I hope this helps in this really weird, confusing time when not too long ago, most people selling LSD had to worry about going to prison. And a lot of these folks are now going to be making a bunch of money. So how do we deal with that? What do we want? What should we think about it? Is there a good way to do it? Can we do it well? You know, a lot of these questions and more Bennet and I get into on the show. And I think it's a really great episode. So I hope y'all appreciate this one. Kyle and I saw Bennet at Horizons, I think in 2019 maybe. And it was really impressive. I was really stoked. Probably one of my more favorite talks in the whole conference. So just really happy Bennet was able to make it on the show and we were able to share it with you all. So let us know what you think on the other side or email us at psychedelicstodayemail@gmail.com. And worth noting is that we have Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists. Our 8-week package is now for sale. It's 8 weeks of live supported classes paired with lots of educational stuff you do outside of class time. So the concept is you do a bunch of reading and prep and watching videos and lectures and whatnot and come to class ready to talk about it. And we are approved for CEs for therapists and psychologists in the state of California. And as many of you know, credits from California are highly transferable. So if you need CEs, maybe check out what we've got to offer over at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. And yeah, I guess that's it for now. If you have any questions about that, hit us up. Again, psychedelicstodayemail@gmail.com, and happy to answer any questions. So limited spaces on that. If you want to join, better to secure your spot now than later. And I guess without further ado, on with Bennet Zelner. Enjoy. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Today on the show, we have Bennet Zelner. Bennet, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Joe. Thanks. How are you doing?
Wonderful. Beautiful day here in Colorado.
Excellent. Yeah, same here.
Are the leaves turning in New York?
So I am upstate. I'm about 2 hours north of the city. I'm sitting on by the side of a lake, and you can just see the beginning of leaves turning. There are kind of orange flourishes on some of the trees. So I think we're at the very start of the process.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, we're deep in it up here. We're at about 9,000 feet of altitude, so it comes early.
I can imagine.
Yeah, it's beautiful. So Kyle and I encountered you when you were on stage contributing to a panel at Horizons last October in 2019. And it was, the most exciting of panels, in terms of what we were expecting. And for me, you're kind of the highlight of the discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. The rest of it kind of didn't seem to really move the needle for me in terms of information. But, you having a very different background from people running either a pharma company or a retreat, it was very different.
Right.
Yeah, I forget who else was on there. We had Synthesis, George Goldsmith from Compass. And do you remember who else?
Let's see. There was Rachel. Yeah, so Rachel Adam from Synthesis, George Goldsmith from Compass, and wow, it doesn't seem like it was that long ago, but I'm drawing a blank on.
It's almost a full year.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, Bob Jesse.
That's right. Yeah, I wanted more from him. I was really hoping he was going to be the rock star.
Yeah,
but I didn't know your name until.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I think Bob is a very genteel person, and
he was very tactful. I don't think he wanted to piss anybody off.
Yes, that's correct.
He had Dr. James Recker from the UK, from King's College.
That's right. I hadn't encountered him before, but I now remember him.
He had a good story about going through customs and saying, do I tell them I'm going to a psychedelic conference or what? I don't know. Didn't sleep.
That's a tough call. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. So your presentation was kind of interesting to me because we talked a lot about, or you talked a lot about, like, alternate models. Because typically we see when people talk about inclusion of psychedelics long-term, like, is this going to be dominated by psychiatry or retreat businesses or pharma? And perhaps there's other ways to approach this, maybe from spiritual or community-based things. But I think your angle of like localization, I believe, like how do we make it centered around the community? You can correct me if I'm wrong, but
Right. No,
what was
that's a
your general
fair.
track there?
Yeah. So I have an approach that I discussed at the conference that's known as the pollination approach. And the pollination approach, you've already described it well. It focuses, or it's centered on the intrinsic interdependence of individual and community well-being. And I don't know how much detail you want me to go into about it
Oh, go
right
for
now.
it.
But
Yeah,
okay,
feel free.
so you know, so I think to really fully appreciate the pollination approach, it's helpful to think about how the current approach to mental health care works. And the current approach is a pharmaceutical centered approach. It treats mental distress in much the same way as a physiological disease. So different quote unquote disorders are defined as clusters of symptoms. And the idea is that you can treat these symptoms with medication, with psychiatric drugs. And you know, the one of the issues with that approach is that it's extremely individual centered. So the idea that you can treat all different forms of mental distress by simply medicating people really doesn't take into account the psychosocial influences on someone's mental health. And this individualistic orientation is not limited just to our approach to mental health care itself. This individualistic orientation pervades our entire culture and our entire approach to business. And there's a lot of evidence, and we can talk about some of the evidence a little bit later if you want to. There's a lot of evidence that this kind of hyper individualism, not just these individualistic values, but also the way that this hyper individualism is reflected in our social systems, in our economic systems, in our ecological systems, is that this hyper individualism is contributing to a great deal of mental distress in the first place. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to, at least in my view, to try to heal or treat someone's mental distress using an approach that embodies the same kind of hyper individualistic values and hyper individualistic practices that are making people sick in the first place. Okay, so
Right.
that's kind of that's the context. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, the pollination approach recognizes that the well-being of the individual and of the community are intrinsically interdependent. So a pollinator organization in general, which could be a mental health care clinic of some sort, but it could also be another type of business organization. A pollinator organization is one that renews and recirculates community resources. So in terms of mental health care, a mental health care clinic embodying the pollination approach, you could think of as a people pollinator. In kind of stark economic terms, it renews and recirculates human resources. So the idea is basically as follows. If someone receives psychedelic therapy or psychedelic assisted therapy, one of the primary channels through which that helps them get better is by creating an openness to connection, with oneself, with other people, and with the planet. And there's some great research on this subject by Roz Watts and others. But if someone goes through treatment and they have this openness to connection, and then you thrust them back into the same disconnected, alienating environment that was likely contributing to their mental distress in the first place, then you're giving up a lot of the potential healing that I think psychedelics can bring. So under the pollination approach, the idea is to take advantage of this window of openness that people have following treatment with psychedelics and explicitly reconnect them to community systems. So that means things like group integration activities, but also actually helping people reconnect to business organizations in the community, to cultural institutions in the community, helping them reconnect to nature. And in helping people reconnect, you're not only furthering the healing of the individual, you're also helping to revitalize these same community systems that have deteriorated in our culture, especially over the last 30 or 40 years. So there are more aspects to it, but I feel like that was kind of a long start. So I'll pause there, and I can either elaborate or answer questions or whatever makes sense.
So let's see. I want to back up briefly to kind of your early point about some of the fundamental causes of a lot of our psychic disease is this individuation and not individuation, sorry, individualism.
I would say hyper-individualism. So
Can you dig into what that looks like? Like what I think is I have to have 5 Mercedes and 2 mansions, otherwise I'm a failure. Like on the far end.
Yeah. So I think that's that kind of. So what you're talking about, I would think of as this kind of consumptive behavior. This idea that we have to consume more in order to be happy, and I think that's intimately related to these kind of hyper-individualistic values and practices that I was talking about. So I think about it in terms of several related crises. So the first crisis, and I'm certainly not the first one to speak about this, nor did I coin the term, but the first crisis is what has often been referred to as a crisis of connection. And the crisis of connection is reflected in the decline in all sorts of community institutions over the past, as I mentioned earlier. I think these trends have been most pronounced over, say, the past 4 decades. It's also reflected in what the former U.S. Surgeon General has referred to as an epidemic of loneliness.
Yeah.
So this is the crisis of connection. This is a crisis. If you want to think about it in terms of systems, this is a crisis in social systems. Paralleling that is what I refer to as a crisis of extraction in economic systems. So all throughout the U.S. and in many other parts of the world, giant corporations have displaced local businesses and now account for a much greater fraction of employment and economic activity than they ever did before. And as a result, the bulk of the economic value being produced in local communities is sent out of the community. It's extracted by distant shareholders. And so the financial proceeds from this economic activity are not available to be recirculated in the local economy. So local economies are being completely starved of the economic resources and of the financial resources that they would otherwise have to keep themselves healthy and to keep themselves sustained. So you have people who are suffering from this crisis of connection due to these hyper-individualistic values and the decline of community institutions. In addition, you have this crisis of extraction. So you have the economic gains being extracted from communities, creating even more alienation and a great deal of economic distress in many places. And then you also have what I refer to as a crisis of depletion. And this and again, this has a lot to do with the fact that you have large corporations, large global corporations accounting for a great deal of economic activity. So you have decisions about the way communities' resources are being used, the way their human resources are being used, the way their natural resources are being used. You have decisions being made about the way all forms of community resources are being used by distant decision makers who aren't in contact with the local ecosystem. and make decisions in a way that favors the interests of these distant shareholders and doesn't fully account for the effects of these decisions on the well-being and regenerative capacity of the communities themselves. So all of these crises, these crisis of connection, crisis of extraction, crisis of depletion, these are obviously intimately interrelated. And I think, and together, I think they're contributing to increased rates of mental distress reflected in depression, anxiety, addiction, suicide. So I could go on, but I think, again, I've given you a very long answer.
And I think in like concrete terms, how I saw this was I went to school in a really small town in New Hampshire, and we, in about 2004, I think, had a Walmart built, or 2005. It was right around the time I was leaving. It was a really big discussion. The community was able to hold it off for 3-4 years, but eventually we're not able to fight it fully. And what we've seen, and this is kind of the common, Walmart story, right? And this, I don't want to single out Walmart. It's just one of many institutions.
It's okay. Well, when I talk about this stuff, I have them on one of my slides. So it's kind of the poster child. So.
Right. I think it is for most people, because it's like, they're making these decisions in Arkansas or wherever, and no relation to what's happening in town. Do people really want it? Like, how many businesses are going to go out of business? How many?
Right.
Yeah. Like the ecosystem gets kind of ruined. I'm seeing some analogy to like a permaculture system where, we want to critique like modern agriculture, where we're doing like monoculture with tons of pesticides, versus like, how do we reduce the amount of pesticides and inputs we need by amplifying diversity like crazy, and understanding the ecology of these things.
No, absolutely. And the pollination approach is rooted in a core ecological principle, which is that the health of a system and of the elements in the system depends on the continual renewal and recirculation of resources within that system. Yeah. And that's the complete opposite of what we have right now. Again, we have this social and economic patterns of disconnection, extraction, and depletion. So so I think looking to nature and looking to ecological principles is exactly the right way to think about it.
Yeah. So I guess these same models seem to be similar to like, okay, cool. All of these pharma companies are owned by a, New York based or UK based pharma company. And we're going to continually give money to them,
right.
in the, at really high levels. Like, this is not going to be cheap as a therapeutic intervention. So yeah, like what happens if that $50,000 stays locally, or $10,000 stays in the city as opposed to zooming off elsewhere?
No, absolutely. I think, we often hear about the idea that what we think of as free markets are the most efficient way to do things. And there's also, certainly for the last 30 or 40 years, there's been a deeply embedded belief in shareholder primacy, the idea that shareholders, the interests of shareholders should be prioritized over those of other stakeholders. But these views don't recognize the huge economic and social benefits of having of recirculating the $50,000 you were just talking about, of recirculating income locally. So when you have local recirculation of income, you have what economists refer to as a multiplier effect. So this $50,000, let's say this $50,000 you were talking about, let's say it's the profits from some local business. So that if that business is locally owned, and on top of that, let's say it's also buying some of a lot of its inputs locally, then a big fraction of that $50,000 goes into the pockets of people in the community, and they're able to not only spend it but also invest it. And this creates a process of pollination. It's a process of lighting up new economic opportunities and allowing these multiplier effects to accrue. And I think that if we were to take into account, you know, the multiplier effects of local economic activity more fully, I think if there are ways for people and communities to see, for example, how much more of a positive impact spending $1 at a local business has on the local community than it does if, say, they spend that same dollar at Walmart, that we'd have, much healthier, thriving local economies, and we'd be in much better shape. And a lot of the work that I'm doing is the work that I'm doing in the psychedelic mental health care space is part of a much bigger project, and that project is largely about trying to promote the emergence of new economic patterns and new economic approaches that stimulate the production of multipliers and the capture of these multipliers by local communities.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Are you familiar with the permaculture based system that was getting a lot of press in the mid 2000s, Transition Towns by Rob Hopkins in the UK?
I am not familiar with that particular author or work.
It just sounds a lot like what you're saying. It sounds like they were just trying to get hyper local.
Yeah.
To the point of local currencies and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that if you want to start thinking about ways to promote locally regenerative economies, then having local currencies is a great way, with the right design features. And we could have a whole other podcast talking about that. But I think that's a really important element in incentivizing and stimulating local economic activity. And one of the other projects I'm working on is what we're referring to as a community commerce platform, which is a set of digital governance tools and digital local cryptocurrency for exactly this purpose. So I'm totally on board with that.
Right. And this is right around, I think, when I was getting pretty involved with transition towns in the Northeast. It was right around the time that probably Bitcoin was being written. So like cryptocurrency wasn't even a thing yet. So they were making their own paper and coins. And it was a really exciting time for sure.
Yeah, there's a long history of alternative currencies, pre-crypto. Crypto, and again, I don't want to get too far off the track here, but I think crypto has some advantages because, for one thing, crypto inherently generates a ledger of all transactions. I mean, the technology is called distributed ledger technology. So you automatically have this ledger of all transactions that allows you to track the flow of income. So you can actually start to get a sense of how much of a given dollar that's spent is being recirculated locally. And if you know that, then you can start to build incentives into the system to at a minimum, you can start to build transparency into the system so that people can see what the effect of their spending is. And then you can also start to build incentives into the system to incentivize people to spend locally. So again, that's a whole other discussion, but it's one that I'm very interested in.
Right, because that's one of the biggest issues, right? Like we're not necessarily economically incentivized to spend locally at this point.
Yeah,
in like a short-term perspective, I guess.
Right. Well, we're not incentivized to, but and as I also just said, it's also an information problem. I think people just don't realize it. If you go to Walmart and you see that I can make something up, some product you want to buy, and you see that it's a couple of bucks less at Walmart than it is at a local place. What you're not seeing is the reduction in subsequent local economic activity that's going to occur as a result of the few bucks you just saved at Walmart. And actually in one of the other projects that I'm working on with a few other folks, attempts to quantify that so that people can see what the effects are of spending their money locally versus spending it at outposts of giant corporations. And I think if we can make that information accessible and comprehensible to people, then we can change behavior without even having to build in some kind of strong form incentive.
That's quite a project, but I would love to see that.
Yeah, well, it's actually going pretty well. But again, I think it's probably a subject for another podcast. But I'd be happy to share more as it proceeds. I mean, I've mentioned several projects. I recently co-founded an organization that's known as the Transformative Capital Institute, and the mission of the Transformative Capital Institute is to fund and support different types of pollination projects and pollination enabling technologies. So all of these projects that I'm mentioning are being done in connection with the Transformative Capital Institute. So it's something I would love to stay in touch about. And I certainly want to get the word out.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of psychedelics, are psychedelics and psychedelic assisted therapies like really interesting to you on account of that like longer window of openness to new things like different ways of capital operating, or like what's there for you?
Well, I mean, I'm interested in them for many reasons. I mean, even putting aside the economic framing and all that kind of stuff, I just think that they're extraordinary tools of personal transformation. And I know many who have benefited from the use of psychedelics for personal transformation. And so just on a purely human level, I'm obviously a big fan. In addition, I think that if we really want to help a new economic paradigm emerge, new economic patterns emerge, then there are kind of two sides to that. Okay, so one side is the macro side, and by macro I mean developing new kind of structures and organizations, new rules for the game, if you want to think about it that way.
Right.
That's only part of it. The other part of it is the micro side. And what I mean specifically by the micro side is the fact that we need to also do our own internal personal work if we really want to see a new paradigm emerge. And in particular, at the core of the existing paradigm, so we've talked about this kind of disconnectedness, that there's this myth of disconnection from other people, this myth of disconnection from nature, and that's reflected in this sort of winner-take-all mentality, this hyper-competitive tendencies, if you will. And so eliminating these hyper-competitive tendencies, these sequelae of the established paradigm, I think is just as important as developing and promoting the emergence of these new macro structures. I think even the most enlightened of us still harbor, I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but I think that, I see it in myself. I think that we've been taught by every institution in our society from the time that we were born that we're not enough, that there's not enough to go around, and in order to get ahead, we basically need to win at the expense of someone else who loses. Even once we know even once we recognize how fallacious that is intellectually, there's still a lot of work to be done to eliminate the deep kind of cognitive imprint that, in which that type of thinking is enshrined. So getting back to your question, yes, I think that psychedelics, as I said, they're tools of personal transformation, so they can help people from trauma, et cetera. But I think they can also help people move into new paradigm ways of thinking and behaving. And then, I guess the other part of it is, I've been talking about the importance of pollinator organizations in the new paradigm. And again, pollinator organization is one that renews and recirculates some form of community capital. So, renewing and recirculating human capital is obviously a big part of that project. So I hope those are kind of three different responses to your question. I hope that all made sense.
Totally. So let's give like a concrete example. So I'm going to lay out kind of a scenario, and let's do it in Baltimore for fun.
Okay.
So we got a clinic in Baltimore. We got a psychiatrist, 3 therapists, 3 assistants, and like a admin assistant. So got a bunch of people there. They're providing, say it's the year 2025, and they're operating with MDMA for MDMA assisted psychotherapy. And let's just say there's no other organizations in the mix. It's just them. They buy the drugs, they administer it, they do the whole process. So they all live in the city limits of Baltimore. So what would that organization look like if it was a pollinator organization? Like what could some things be there that they do?
Sure. Well, let me preface this by saying that I think there are general principles that a pollinator embodies, but the specifics, the actual approach needs to emerge locally, because different places have different cultures, maybe different kind of cultural trauma patterns. They have different recirculatory gaps in their social and economic systems. So for a whole bunch of reasons,
every locale has very different issues.
So every locale has different issues and needs to, the specifics of the approach need to emerge locally. But some of the general principles, again, the key is to reconnect people to community systems. So at a minimum, I would think group integration activities. But in an ideal world, the treatment site would also function as a community institution. So it might have other sorts of non-psychedelic practices that are aimed at promoting well-being and which includes community building. It would also have deep ties with other organizations in the community, with business organizations, with cultural organizations. And the purpose of these ties I think the purpose would be twofold, actually. So I think that especially in the short term, if you have a psychedelic clinic and you want to, I think part of what you want to do is create acceptance. I mean, we've had a long history of psychedelics being illegal, and there's still a lot of mythology from the war on drugs. So by partnering with local organizations that are recognized as legitimate by the people who live in the place, you can help to foster acceptance. And on the other side, in terms of pollination, by having these ties with local organizations, you have channels through which people can reconnect to community institutions. So I'll give you an example, actually. So there's a town in England called Frome. It's spelled Frome.
Okay.
And in Frome, I might have a couple of the details off, but I think it was around the year 2012 or 13, sometime around then. They recognized that a lot of people who were coming in to have medical conditions treated complained of loneliness. And so they decided they would start to treat loneliness as a medical condition. And so part of this involves setting up a core of people that they referred to. I think they had 2 different groups of people, but basically they were different. They were connectors. So if somebody came in complaining with a medical condition, complaining of loneliness, they would be assigned one of these connector people. And the connectors would not only point them to resources in the community, kind of health resources and other sorts of resources to improve physical and mental well-being, but they would also help to reconnect these people to these these patients to the community itself. And this program is still going on, and I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head, but there have been academic studies of the program in which they've compared things like hospital admission rates and healthcare costs per capita in Frome to those same figures from neighboring counties, and the numbers in Frome blow the other counties away. One figure in particular I do remember: the UK National Health Service sponsored this program, or at least sponsored part of it. And in one of these studies, it was estimated that for each pound that the UK National Health Service had invested in the program, it received £6 back. So, the idea that you can, so this isn't just, kind of a hypothetical idea. There's actual evidence out there that if you set up your healthcare system in a way that is not only focused on the production of well-being versus just kind of managing disease symptoms, which is the way our current system works, but also explicitly tries to promote well-being by rebuilding community and reconnecting people to the community, then you can not only make people much healthier, but you can save a lot of money too.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting. Do you know what those like loneliest programs looked like? Did they like host bridge games or chess or something? Or
yeah, I mean, so they actually. So I there's a lot more detail than I'm probably going to be able to do justice. Sure. But I know, for example, that they started these cafes called talking cafes where people could just come together and talk. It's pretty simple, right? It doesn't,
yeah.
And I think a lot of it was also just helping people who felt lonely, helping them identify pre-existing organizations or activities in the community where they could come together with other people. I mean, if you just want to think about mental health care and people suffering from various forms of mental distress, I mean, disconnection is a core feature of depression and anxiety, and addiction is oftentimes a response to disconnection. So the people who are suffering from these afflictions are super disconnected, and if you can help to reconnect them, you can. I think it's a critical part of the healing process.
Right. So I guess to leverage like a real world example, and this might be a shitty one, but I'll throw it out there anyway. But so in the way that Patagonia and some other like major corporations are contributing quote unquote 1% to the planet. So for if that group was able to identify some charities and do something locally, like 1% for, Baltimore youth or something, like Baltimore youth sports, or just a way for them to connect, like perhaps that would be something like that, like a dedicated percentage, or would it be more active?
I'm not totally sure I understand what the question is. So
sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
So like Patagonia, for instance, their program to just constantly donate money, 1% of their profits or gross revenue or whatever, to like climate-based or environmental policy stuff. Like that's one model that I've seen at like a very large scale. So is like an intervention this hypothetical group in Baltimore could do, like open up some sort of, not necessarily open the facility up, but donate money to a great local nonprofit that's doing good work? Or is it a different model that you're envisioning?
I mean, I think that sounds great, but I think ideally what we'd like to see is the emergence of fundamentally new economic patterns. And so this gets into a deep question about how do fundamentally new paradigms emerge. And I don't think that you can create a fundamentally new pattern or a fundamentally new paradigm using elements of the previous paradigm, because all of the elements of the previous paradigm necessarily embody and reflect the core logic of that paradigm. So in our current system, every structure, every organization, every institution embodies in some way or other this idea of shareholder primacy, which I mentioned earlier. The fact that the idea that the interests of shareholders should be prioritized over those of all others. So if you try to create a new structure or a new system using legal structures, from the existing paradigm, using financing structures from the existing paradigm, those are very likely going to end up replicating at least some part of the existing paradigm in some way. So, I don't, by the way, I don't want to say that I'm opposed to these efforts. I think there are some really extraordinary efforts going on by some very awake people to use old paradigm or established paradigm elements to create new paradigm patterns. I mean, so there's this organization called Purpose, which has started kind of a movement called steward ownership, which I think is a really strong attempt to do that. So I'm very much in support of those efforts, and I think that they'll go a long way toward creating change. I think at the same time we have to have parallel efforts going on that create a container, that create the space for something fundamentally new to emerge. So that's part that, and that's a big part of our mission at Transformative Capital Institute. Our plan is to fund these pollinator projects, is to give them unconditional funding, and to give them a period of 7 or 10 years during which they'll have the ability to develop new patterns and practices, and also to make course corrections. I mean, in the existing paradigm, you write a business plan, which is largely fictitious anyway, because nobody really knows. You make a bunch of projections, and then if you fail to meet some of the projections, the investors step in and take over. And no matter what your original vision was, what ends up happening is you end up having to operate in a way that emphasize that's geared primarily toward increasing investor returns. So if you really want to promote new paradigm patterns, you have to recognize that anything that we're doing, any new structure or organization that we're creating, is a prototype, and there are going to be learning costs along the way. They're not mistakes. If something doesn't work out exactly the way we expected, that's fine. There's feedback. Learning in that. It's feedback, exactly. Thank you. So, So again, I feel like that was a little bit of a long answer, but I hope.
But I totally get
responsive.
It, right? Like, what a lot of folks might not realize is, we want to yell at CEOs and like boards of these big institutions, but they're kind of hostage legally. Like, a lot of them might want to do right, but they're legally obligated to maximize shareholder value in a lot of ways. And
there are huge institutional pressures for them to maximize shareholder value. And, and I also think, again, this is certainly not a universal statement, but this kind of goes back to what we were talking about before. I think that the sequelae of the existing paradigm they're very hard to remove. So I think there are a lot of folks out there who are very enlightened in many ways, but still, but at some level they still haven't really been able to release the belief that shareholder profit is the primary objective of business. And until people can move beyond that type of thinking, that those sorts of cognitive forces sustain the existing paradigm every bit as much as formal institutional forces like laws and, like laws do.
Right. So the only really big institution that I can even point to that somewhat looks fair is like this Mondragon group.
Right. Yes. Great example.
Can you lay out what that looks like?
Not in as much detail
Right.
as you'd probably like me
Rough
to.
sketch is totally fine.
Yeah, so
And I can make a stab if you want to
yeah, if you want
correct
to
me.
start, if you want to, yeah.
So, big organization, I think Basque or Spanish or something,
Right.
and they are interestingly structured in that the most senior person in the organization can only make X amount more than the lowest paid person in the organization. So, like as the organization makes more money is distributed across the whole organization, not just at the top, like we would see at Walmart,
Right.
for instance.
Right.
And that's as much as I have.
Right. Well, that's kind of what I want. Yeah, that's kind of where I am with it too. I think that there are other layers to what they're doing as well. But yeah, I'm not expert enough on them to really share a great deal more than that.
Sure. Like, have you seen any organizations that you like better, or like that their structure more, like it's more visionary in terms of like transcending where we're at today?
That's, I mean, part of the reason I'm embarrassed about not being able to speak about them in more, with more expertise is that they're the ones who keep on popping up again. And
right.
There are many people who keep on telling me to read about them. It's been suggested that I go visit them. And it's just, I just haven't really been able to delve into learning about them as much as I'd like to.
Right. So, what kind of projects do you have going at Transformative Capital Institute? Like, are you trying to model like organization design?
We have a couple of. So as I mentioned earlier, we have two categories of projects, or maybe I didn't mention this part. So if I didn't, let me say it now.
Sure.
So one category of project is local pollinator projects, and so an example would be, we've been talking about psychedelic mental health care clinics. A psychedelic mental health care clinic embodying the pollination approach could be a local pollinator project, or some kind of regenerative agriculture project could be another one. And so we have a couple of projects in those categories where we're talking to people and helping them nurture a vision for the, for these specific projects right now. The other category of projects that we have, we refer to as meta layer projects. And so these are more like R&D projects. They're basically projects to develop and prototype technologies or structures that promote pollination, and that could be employed in different local pollination projects.
Sure.
So one of these meta layer projects I already talked about a bit. It's the community commerce platform. Another meta layer project I actually alluded to already as well. Another meta layer project is this project in which we're using real world data to start estimating multiplier effects and starting to be able to estimate how much multiplier effect you're giving up by spending your money at an externally owned, kind of typically an outpost of some kind of large corporation versus spending it locally. We're looking into doing another meta layer project, trying to start to estimate the different layers of economic benefit that a community-based psychedelic mental health care facility embodying the pollination approach would produce. So, if you think about it, there are lots of economic benefits that such an organization might produce that wouldn't necessarily show up in shareholder profits, would be real benefits to the community. So, in the first layer, you have people who have been disconnected, who may not have been really fully functioning fully contributing to the economic activity of the local community. If you can help them get better and reconnect them to local economic systems, to local businesses, they start contributing to the economic output of the community. and then along the same lines, you have reduced social welfare costs. You have reduced costs of supporting people who were previously unable to work. In addition, you also have reduced healthcare costs. People who are depressed and anxious have not just large ongoing mental health care expenses, but they also have increased costs of physiological health care.
Right.
And so there's that layer of savings, if you will. So this project is an attempt. I mean, as I said, we're just kind of looking into this project right now, but I think it will be an attempt to start estimating some of those different categories of economic benefits and cost savings, which I think really helps to make a case. Will really help to make a case for the self-sustaining nature of clinics embodying the pollination approach once they're up and running, once they're in operation. So those are a few of the current projects we're working on.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Are you working? So you're teaching at University of Maryland, or are you teaching elsewhere as well?
No, I'm on the faculty at the University of Maryland. I teach in the Smith School of Business, and I teach classes in economics and global business. So I wear many hats.
Yeah, that's outstanding. And who are you collaborating with this Transformative Capital Institute?
So my co-founder is a man named David Armistead, and David is he's an extremely smart guy and a true visionary. He's been working in the general area of kind of sustainability and regenerative projects for several decades, and he's really been a mentor to me. So we co-founded TCI, and we have a couple of other folks that we're working with there. A guy named Josh Duke, a woman named Delara Cesare, and we're starting to do a lot more work with a fellow named Steve Rozonki, who's an MD from Portland who has been running a ketamine clinic there and has interests that overlap with a lot of the stuff we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting. That would be a great place to start, right? Ketamine is such low-hanging fruit, and like 10 cents to produce in China, from what I understand, and $1 a dose here. So like that pharma angle is totally removed.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I think that if you want to start a psychedelic clinic, since you can't actually legally do that right now, starting with ketamine therapy. I mean, ketamine's not a psychedelic, but it's starting to move into that. It's kind of moving toward that space. So I think starting a ketamine clinic is a really great way to go. And in terms of the comments you were just making about cost, I mean, ketamine itself is not expensive. It's very safe. It's been around for a long time. You do have, there's now a patented form of ketamine from Johnson & Johnson known as ketamine, which is extremely costly. And, there are a few additional rules that have been placed around how it can be used. And, I think there's a real question as to, I think you have to wonder about what Johnson & Johnson's motives are, and whether this is an attempt to start to monopolize a market for something that shouldn't even really be patentable, in my view.
Did you see the recent news they got in the UK about that? I think they were shut down twice by NHS, saying it's just too expensive.
I didn't know that, but that makes a lot of sense, because it, in most, well, certain, I don't know about most, but certainly in the EU, and I think this is true in the UK as well, in order for a drug to be approved, there has to be evidence not only of its efficacy, but also of its cost effectiveness.
Yeah.
And we don't require any such review here. But there is an organization called ICER that makes these assessments itself. So the data are out there. It's just it's not part of the regulatory process.
Right.
I something else I'll say. I don't have data in hand to demonstrate this yet, although I think there will soon be some evidence available on this point. I think that over the long run, there will be a very strong cost effectiveness case to be made for psychedelic therapy versus more conventional therapies as well. So, stay tuned. I think we'll be hearing more about that pretty soon.
Like that I think it's a real easy argument, Bennett. It's like, you just have to see the figures, but
Just have to see the figures, right? Yeah.
it's orders of magnitude higher performance than traditional talk therapy, or keeping somebody on SSRIs for 30 years, which SSRIs were not designed to be in human bodies for 30 years.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Great tool, but not necessarily the best for long-term maintenance. And
right. Well, yeah. I mean, in fact, if you look at the evidence, there is very weak evidence of long-term efficacy, and in fact, there's
worse than placebo is what I've read in some Emperor's New Drugs or something like that.
Well, there have been a couple of meta-analyses, and the most recent one, I don't remember the exact figures, so I don't want to be fully quoted on this, but
sure.
It basically found that the beneficial effects were limited to those with the most severe depression and relatively short-term in nature. And the additional issue you have is what's known as oppositional tolerance. And that refers to the tolerance that your brain develops to taking a psychiatric medication, to taking an antidepressant for a long period of time. And so that, you're making, there's kind of a trade-off. You might get a little boost from it initially, but you might end up actually feeling worse if you take it. If you take it for a long time, you might actually end up feeling worse if you try to get off of it. So, if you think about it, I mean, you basically have pharmaceutical companies, creating long-term addiction in a way that's probably not producing any sort of long-term benefit for most of the people. It's a great model for rewarding shareholders, or not, maybe rewarding is the wrong word. It's a great model for boosting shareholder profit, but it doesn't seem to be nearly as good a model for creating well-being among the people being treated.
Right. It's a really tough deal. Because we want this system where everybody's happy and healthy, but we keep putting money into a system that keeps causing disease, it seems like.
Yes. So I think in terms of shifting to a new paradigm in the healthcare system, I think the key shift needs to be one from a system that's meant, or the system that is focused on managing disease or managing disease symptoms, which is what we currently have. Or if you want to, even be a little bit more cynical, you could even say, as you were just saying, maybe that even creates disease. I don't know if I would go that far, but it certainly is focused on managing disease. And the shift that needs to take place is toward a system that's focused on producing well-being. Mm-hmm. And I think psychedelics have a big role to play in that type of system. There's certainly many other sorts of modalities that can contribute to creating well-being and other sorts of inputs. But I think that's the key shift. Yeah. But I think I kind of think the key takeaway from what we were just talking about is that creating well-being isn't necessarily profitable for shareholders in the way that treating chronic disease, in the way that treating diseases or treating chronic diseases. And there are many other stakeholders who receive huge dividends from the production of well-being. I mean, it's almost tautological to say that. And so what you would like to see is a system in which those different classes of stakeholders have more of a say over how things are done, have play more of a role in governance. And this is why I think the ideal of shareholder primacy is so antithetical to producing well-being in general, and to to establishing psychedelic mental health care clinics in particular. I just think they're fundamentally incompatible.
Mm-hmm. Right. Especially at like that scale, like when we're talking about publicly traded things. And
yeah. Well, that's a whole other, I mean, the stock markets and publicly traded companies, that this adds a whole other layer on.
Right.
Because now, I mean, you talk about extracting economic resources from the community and disconnection between decision making and the actual, and the actual operation of a business. I mean,
Yeah, it's a big deal. It's a whole tricky situation. I've been trying to like struggle with a lot of this myself, and from my perspective, it feels really intractable. But it seems like really smart people like yourself are working on this stuff. So
yeah, and I think it's important to remember that we don't have to take individual responsibility for boiling the ocean.
Right.
I mean, seriously, if you look at the way that change happens in nature, change can happen as an emergent process. So you have little pockets of change, shifts in the way things are done, or shifts in the way things operate, and they aggregate up. And when they all become connected through a network, you see systemic change. So I'll give you a more concrete example. That one was a little bit abstract. If you look at the fall of the Soviet Union, you had these movements that started in individual republics, and these republics were fairly disconnected from each other because the Soviets, they restricted information flows.
Right.
So it's not like they could read about each other in the newspaper. And you had these movements starting in these disconnected republics, and there were some similar principles and ideas. And when these movements all happened around the same time, the entire Soviet system collapsed, and things, and you had systemic change. So I like to think about it more that way. I'll tell you, there's something else that I find very hopeful. There was a study that was done that it compared violent protests to nonviolent protests, and I don't remember exactly how many years of data they had, but they had a pretty big data set going back, 50 or 100 years, something like that. Yeah. And there were two findings that I found particularly interesting. And one of the findings was that, on the whole, nonviolent protests were more effective at achieving their objectives than violent protests were. But the other one, which is more, I think, more relevant to what we were just talking about, is that in order for and this is an average, of course, but in order for a nonviolent protest to succeed in achieving its objectives, on average, it had to reach 3.5% of the population. And then you get to this kind of tipping point, and the protest, whatever the idea was, or the, whatever was change was being sought, the idea would take off. And so if you think about it that way, we need to plant these seeds of change, which is a pollination process. So we have these seeds of change in different places, and you probably don't. I think people often think, oh my God, we have to get to like over 50% of the population or 100% of the population in order to make this work. But I think we can probably get to a relatively small percentage of the population. And once you have a fundamentally different way of thinking and doing things, once you have this new belief system in place among a relatively small percentage of the population, it will then diffuse, and there'll be this sort of network effect and reach a tipping point. And that's what I imagine happening in the future.
Great. Yeah. As we're recording in late September here, this might not come out till November or December, by the way, but like we're feeling really like a boiling point culturally, and especially in the States. I don't know how it feels out there, but it feels a little Civil War-y out here in Colorado at times. But
I think what we're experiencing is a meta crisis, and so a meta crisis is the concurrent collapse or concurrent crises in multiple different systems. So we have crises in our economic systems, crises in our social systems, crises in our ecological systems. Obviously, we have crises in health systems right now. And there's an area, there's a body of thinking and research known as complex systems theory.
Yeah.
And in a complex system, and so these are all examples of complex systems, and these are deeply interconnected complex systems. So in complex systems theory, if a system experiences a small or a moderate disturbance, its tendency is to go back to its previous equilibrium. So you look back to the 1960s. You had the civil rights movement, you had an anti-war movement. So you had these disturbances to the current paradigm, if you will, but they weren't quite large enough. And what you saw in the subsequent several decades was not only a reversion to the way things had been, but actually an amplification of the existing system. In complex systems theory, the way that change takes place is you have to have a large disturbance that sends the system to a point of near chaos, and it's from that chaotic state that a fundamentally new paradigm, a form of higher order complexity, as they put it, can emerge. And so if we look at the world today, we look at the massive disruptions in all of our major systems. As I said, I think we're in a state of meta crisis, and that, as painful and frightening as the state of near chaos that we are currently experiencing is, I think it may also be what's necessary in order for true change to take place.
Mm. Right. Like I didn't expect it to look like this. I think I expected it to look a lot more like tragic, like, not like this isn't very tragic, but I expected it to be a lot more severe.
Yeah, I hate to sound, gloomy, and sort of hate to say this, but I don't think this is it. I think that I think COVID is obviously, COVID and the political dysfunction that we're currently witnessing or experiencing, they're obviously terrifying events, and the human toll, especially of COVID, is beyond tragic. And at the same time, I am afraid that we're probably going to experience more and more massively disruptive events like this, that these are the symptoms of the incipient, or maybe it's not even incipient anymore, but of the collapse of the current paradigm. So yeah, I don't know exactly what it will look like either, but I think there will probably be, unfortunately, a great deal of suffering in order for, along the path to improvement.
Right. And to tie it back to psychedelics, like, there's going to be a big shift. Psychedelics will be able to help us with that big shift, though it's not going to be painless.
Oh, absolutely. I think, just look, think about COVID. Think about so I don't have them off the top of my head, but I've seen some statistics recently that reflect the large increases in anxiety, depression, I think now probably also suicide, that are almost certainly attributable to COVID. So these are all fairly recent changes in numbers. Like things like the number of calls to mental health crisis hotlines, stuff like this that can be tracked pretty quickly. So there's obviously a huge psychological toll, and there are going to be a lot of people. There are a lot of people who need help now, and there are going to be a lot more people who need help in the future. And I really, I think we're so fortunate to be at a moment in time when psychedelics and psychedelic therapy will be available to help the huge numbers of people who are going to, who are suffering mentally and emotionally as a result of the current crisis. If you even just look at Hong Kong, and you look at the fallout in terms of PTSD from the SARS epidemic, which was obviously much more short-lived than the COVID epidemic has been. that was pretty significant in itself. So I really shudder to think at what the fallout from this is going to be. But again, the possibility of using psychedelics to help people is it gives me a lot of hope.
Right. Absolutely. And I'm trying to avoid bringing more gloom, but this projection around like 1/7 of the world population not having a home in like 40 years on account of major environmental disruption is
Yeah.
like another big thing. Like we need to get rid of this psychedelic thing under control soon
Yeah.
so that we can
Yeah.
help all those people.
Well, and it's funny because I actually purposely avoided going. And when we were talking a
Mhm.
few minutes ago about crises and about meta crisis and systems breakdown,
Mhm.
I intentionally avoided going into climate and eco crisis because it's just very difficult to think about.
Right. It's really hard to like even model how that looks with like keeping our current systems in place. Like, is that just going to keep going?
Yeah.
Is it just going to keep getting more and more ugly? And it's a weird thing to consider, perhaps, but hopefully
Yeah.
as people get more educated, things shift.
Yeah. Well, and again, I really don't want to sound like I think psychedelics are in and of themselves the answer to everything because I don't think that. But there is a lot of evidence that psychedelics, among other things, create greater nature connectedness.
Mhm.
And and if you're talking about educating people and helping them become more aware of ecological consequences of our behavior, I think that psychedelics have a role to play there too.
Mm. Right. Yeah. Like I certainly don't think they're panacea, but you can play a big part in the
Yeah.
ecosystem of change that's required. And yeah, let's hope we get there. And let's hope it works out well.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And if things just keep getting super corporate, I don't know. Perhaps we just need more Burning Mans or something to have a slight escape once in a while. But who knows? Really, it's going to be an interesting ride.
Yeah.
Cool, Bennett. Was there anything we didn't really discuss that you would like to highlight?
No, I think we actually covered way more than I expected to. So,
Cool.
yeah. So no, I think that was a pretty well-rounded discussion.
Great. Well, Bennet Zelner, Ph.D. Where do you have a website that you want people to check out or anything like that?
I keep on thinking I should put one up, but I haven't as of yet. So,
Yeah.
it's I guess I'm wasting some free advertising here. But
well,
pretty
let's hope
soon,
you get one by the time we get this up, and we'll have it in the show notes.
Yeah, cool. I mean, I certainly hope by the time this comes out, we'll have at least a rudimentary website up for the Transformative Capital Institute. So, whoever's listening, take a look in the show notes, and that will be the website to check out.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I hope we can do it again in the future, and really excited to see what you come up with.
Great. Well, thanks a lot. I really appreciate your inviting me, and it was great chatting with you.
And there you have it, everybody. Bennet Zelner. I hope you all really enjoyed that. It was really fun for us. And I think there's a lot to think about here regarding economics and psychedelics. How can we do it properly? What might we as a culture, as professionals, might we run into in the future that could be a problem for us? And how can we continue to do better? This incremental improvement thing is a big deal. And if we can maybe even take a couple revolutionary steps in there too, like all the better. We've got a lot of problems on Earth. A lot of them are economically oriented and sourced. So lots of room to think about this stuff. And I'm curious to hear what you have to say. So if you want to email us directly, psychedelicstodayemail@gmail.com, or our Facebook group, just search Psychedelics Today group there. We always read our comments on Instagram and Twitter as well. So feel free to hit us up on those places. And I guess that's it. Thanks again, Bennet, for joining us. And if y'all want to support us, tell a friend about the podcast, or maybe check out our free classes or some of our less expensive offerings. And we've got a premier offering called Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists, an 8-week live supported program with lots of material. It's very well structured so that you go from knowing next to nothing to being fluent in a bunch of different theories and methods and much more. This isn't a class. You're not taking an 8-week class and learning how to be a psychedelic therapist in 8 weeks. That's not what this is. This is more of a foundational class, so you understand the whole landscape and how you might want to fit into it. We do think you're going to be really well equipped to at least be able to discuss this stuff at a high level after the class. So, yeah, essentially, this is something, if you want to be professionally involved, we suggest this kind of class as a way in, and it's interactive, not boring, CE credits, all that kind of good stuff. So check it out at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. And I guess that's it. So without further ado, this is Joe Moore signing off for Psychedelics Today. See you on the next episode. Take care, everybody.